My parents stole $250,000 from my safe, claiming it was for your brother. When I filed a lawsuit, their reaction was unbelievable. I'm Emily, 19 years old, and my life has been a whirlwind of family betrayal and drama ever since my grandparents passed away. They were incredible people, the kind of grandparents everyone dreams of, and losing them was devastating. But the chaos that followed the reading of their will? That's a whole other story. Here's the backstory. My grandparents had meticulously planned their estate. They left me $180,000 to cover my education, a gesture that felt like a vote of confidence in my future. My brother Luke, who's 27, inherited the family's antique jewelry collection, valued at over $80,000. Beautiful pieces steeped in history and sentiment. My parents, meanwhile, were left the family home and a substantial portion of savings. On the surface, it seemed fair. Everyone received something meaningful, and their wishes were clear. Or so I thought. The first cracks appeared as soon as we left the lawyer's office. At the reading, I was stunned by my inheritance. It was far more than I ever imagined. I wasn't particularly close to my grandparents, but knowing they believed in me enough to invest in my education meant everything. Luke, on the other hand, was visibly less enthused about his share. The jewelry, while valuable, wasn't liquid cash, and it was obvious he didn't fully appreciate its significance. My parents' expressions, though, were something else. My mom, especially, seemed displeased that Luke hadn't received the house or a direct financial windfall. Tension escalated quickly. Back at home, my mom cornered Luke, insisting the jewelry should stay in the family and accusing him of planning to sell it. Luke, being Luke, brushed her off with his usual smugness, declaring it was his to do with as he pleased. My dad chimed in, trying to convince Luke to let them safeguard the collection. The argument spiraled, and I began to see how quickly greed was unraveling whatever remained of our family unity. A week later, Luke showed up at my apartment with a pouch of jewelry, dumping its contents on my kitchen table. Sparkling earrings, rings, and brooches lay scattered across the surface. He pointed to a locket and said there was something odd about it. Inside, behind an old photo of our grandparents, was a tiny folded note. It read, "To the keeper of this locket, the truth lies within." Neither of us knew what it meant, but it added a strange layer of mystery to an already chaotic situation. Meanwhile, my parents' behavior took a sharp turn. They began dropping hints that I should help Luke with my inheritance, calling constantly to remind me that families should look out for each other. When I refused, they ramped up their efforts. One day, I came home to find my dad rifling through my desk. His excuse? He was looking for a pen. It was clear they were testing boundaries, and I started locking everything from my documents to my laptop. Things came to a head when Luke discovered his jewelry collection had been stolen. No forced entry, no witnesses, just gone. My gut immediately told me the culprit wasn't a stranger. My suspicions were confirmed when Luke found the entire collection in our parents' safe. Furious, he confronted them, and their weak excuses about keeping it safe fell apart under his rage. It was a messy, screaming showdown, with accusations flying from all sides. I stood in stunned silence, wondering how it had come to this. But the worst was yet to come. A month later, I received a call from my mom inviting me over for dinner. I thought it might be an attempt to mend fences, but the moment I arrived, it was clear something was off. Luke and his fiancée, Megan, were there, grinning like they'd won the lottery. My parents beamed with pride, champagne glasses in hand. When I asked what was going on, my mom announced they'd bought Luke and Megan a house. A beautiful 3-bedroom in Oakwood Hills, one of the priciest neighborhoods in town. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. When I demanded to know how they could afford such a thing, my dad casually mentioned they'd used the fund. It took me a moment to process that he meant my fund, the money my grandparents had left for my education. My mom dismissed my outrage, claiming it was for the good of the family, and exactly what my grandparents would have wanted. Luke, for his part, tried to justify it by pointing out that there was still plenty left for my education, but his entitlement only deepened the betrayal. I couldn't let it go. The money wasn't just numbers on a ledger. It represented my future, my security, and a trust my grandparents had placed in me. My parents had violated that trust without a second thought. After days of stewing and countless failed attempts to reason with them, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed a lawsuit against my own parents. Their reaction was predictably explosive. They called me selfish, ungrateful, and immature, accusing me of tearing the family apart. Luke and Megan, naturally, sided with them, painting themselves as innocent beneficiaries of my supposed overreaction. But I stood firm. This wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for myself, reclaiming the respect and autonomy they had taken from me. As the court date loomed, I prepared for the battle ahead, knowing it would forever change my relationship with my family. What I didn't realize was just how deep the rift would go, and how much more I'd uncover about the people I thought I knew. When I confronted my parents, anger surged through me like a tidal wave. The years of frustration, betrayal, and manipulation all boiled over as I held up my phone, demanding answers. My mom didn't even blink. Her calm, dismissive tone only stoked the fire inside me. She asked, feigning confusion, what I could possibly mean. But we both knew the truth. I repeated myself, louder this time, my voice trembling with rage. Where was my money? The fund my grandparents had left for my education, my future, the one thing I had been counting on to avoid drowning in student debt, was gone. My dad finally appeared from the other room, his face hard and defensive. He asked what was going on, as if he didn't already know. I laid it out clearly. The bank had informed me of multiple withdrawals totaling $250,000, all made over the past year. My parents were the only ones with access to the account, and I demanded to know why they had stolen from me. My dad's face darkened, but my mom stayed eerily composed, her arms crossed as though this was just another teenage tantrum. Her justification was as shocking as the theft itself. She said it was for Luke, as though that made it acceptable. According to her, helping him and Megan buy their dream house was a decision they made for the family, something my grandparents would have wanted. The sheer audacity of her words left me momentarily speechless. I reminded her that the fund was for my education, explicitly stated in the will. That money was meant to ensure I could build a future without the crushing burden of debt. She waved it off as if it were a minor inconvenience. My dad, red-faced and defensive, joined in, accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish. He said I was young and had time to figure things out, as if that excused what they had done. The words stung more than I thought they would. They didn't see their actions as theft. They saw them as parental privilege. They had taken what was never theirs to take, all while framing themselves as the heroes of this twisted narrative. I told them about the university expenses I now couldn't afford, how I was scrambling to make ends meet because of their choices. My mom dismissed me with a shrug, suggesting I apply for scholarships or take out loans. My dad, growing more irritated, declared the conversation over, as though that was the end of it. The moment solidified what I had long suspected. They didn't care. Not about my future, not about the promises my grandparents had made to me, and certainly not about the trust they had shattered. Their focus was on Luke and Megan, as it always had been. My education and my dreams were collateral damage in their twisted version of family loyalty. When I left their house, my hands were shaking, and my chest felt tight with a mix of anger and despair. They had taken more than money. They had stolen my security, my trust, and the one thing my grandparents had left to support me. Over the next few days, the weight of what had happened settled heavily on me. I couldn't concentrate on anything. University plans that once filled me with excitement now seemed overwhelming and impossible. I began researching legal options, desperate for a way to take back control of my life. Filing a lawsuit against my parents felt like a betrayal in itself, but I knew I had no other choice. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the principle, about standing up for myself and the promises my grandparents had made. They had trusted my parents to protect that fund, and instead, they had betrayed that trust in the most egregious way. I reached out to an attorney to understand my rights and whether I had a case. The process was daunting, but I was determined. Every time I hesitated, I thought about the sacrifices my grandparents had made to set aside that money and the blatant disregard my parents had shown in taking it. It wasn't just about recovering what was stolen, it was about reclaiming my future. Even as I prepared to take this step, my parents showed no remorse. They flaunted Luke and Megan's new house as if it were their crowning achievement, hosting gatherings and proudly showcasing the marble countertops and spacious backyard. It was a mockery of everything I had lost, a constant reminder of their betrayal. Luke and Megan, meanwhile, remained oblivious. They acted as though the house was their rightful prize, shrugging off my protests as bitterness. Megan's attempts to smooth things over with patronizing comments about how I'd figure it out someday only added fuel to the fire. Luke, ever self-centered, told me to stop being negative and accept that this was just how things were. I was done accepting. This wasn't just how things were. It was theft, plain and simple, and I wasn't going to let them continue to walk all over me. Filing a lawsuit felt like an impossible mountain to climb, but it was my only way forward. My grandparents had believed in me enough to leave me that money, and I owed it to them, and to myself, not to let their sacrifice go to waste. When I confronted my parents about the missing money, the rage inside me felt unstoppable. I demanded to know what they had done with the fund my grandparents had left for my education. My dad, sitting on the couch with the TV on, barely glanced in my direction as he calmly told me they had used it to help the family. The words hit me like a slap. They didn't even try to sugarcoat it. They had spent my college fund on Luke and Megan's house. My voice rose as I pointed out the obvious. They had stolen money that wasn't theirs. My mom rolled her eyes, brushing off my outrage as though I were being melodramatic. She called it a good investment, claiming Luke and Megan needed a place to build their future and that they were simply helping them get started. The sheer gall of it left me speechless for a moment. When I reminded them the money wasn't theirs to give, my dad waved it off, telling me I could always take out loans like most people do. The conversation spiraled quickly. My mom accused me of acting selfishly and ungratefully, dismissing my concerns with a smirk that only fueled my anger. She actually laughed when I brought up how expensive college was and how little was left in the fund, barely enough for one semester, let alone 4 years. Her flippant suggestion that I should apply for scholarships or figure it out left me shaking with rage. When I told her they had no right to make that decision, she crossed her arms, her face hardening. She called me dramatic and claimed they had done what was best for the family. The words stung, not because I believed them, but because they perfectly captured the toxic favoritism that had defined my family for years. This wasn't about what was best for the family. It was about what was best for Luke. It always had been. My dad, clearly tired of the conversation, stood up and ended it with a finality that made my blood boil. My mom, meanwhile, delivered one last, smug remark as I stormed out. "What are you going to do, sue us?" Her mocking tone made it clear she didn't believe I would. That single comment, dripping with arrogance, planted the seed of an idea I hadn't considered until then. I called my best friend Olivia as soon as I left, my voice breaking as I explained everything. She listened in stunned silence before telling me I couldn't let them get away with it. Olivia had always known how toxic my family could be, but even she was shocked by the sheer audacity of what my parents had done. She urged me to stand up for myself, to find a way to fight back, no matter how daunting it seemed. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching my options. I spoke with a lawyer, who explained that while I had a case, it wouldn't be easy. My parents had legal access to the account, so proving misuse would require substantial evidence and persistence. Still, I was determined to try. It wasn't just about the money. It was about holding them accountable and reclaiming some sense of agency over my life. When I told my parents I was serious about suing them, they reacted with predictable arrogance. My mom laughed again, calling me foolish and accusing me of embarrassing the family. My dad insisted I should be grateful they hadn't used all the money. Their dismissive attitude made it clear they didn't take me seriously. Luke, meanwhile, was no better. When I confronted him, hoping he might feel some guilt for benefiting from their theft, he brushed it off as though he bore no responsibility. Luke's indifference was infuriating. He admitted knowing where the money had come from but shrugged it off, saying it wasn't his decision to make. When I pointed out that he had accepted the house without question, he rolled his eyes and told me to be realistic. He even had the audacity to suggest I was overreacting, telling me I'd figure it out because I was smart. His casual dismissal of my struggles was the final straw. Feeling cornered and outnumbered, I realized I needed someone on my side, someone who truly understood the weight of this betrayal. That's when I thought of my Uncle Henry. Unlike my parents, Uncle Henry had always been kind and supportive. He had distanced himself from the family's toxic dynamics years ago, carving out a life far removed from the drama. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I decided to take a chance and reach out. Calling him was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My hands trembled as I dialed his number, unsure how he would react. When he answered, his warm, familiar voice immediately eased some of my anxiety. I hesitated, choking back tears as I explained what had happened. I told him about the stolen fund, the house my parents had bought for Luke, and their complete lack of remorse. By the time I finished, I was crying so hard I could barely speak. Uncle Henry didn't interrupt. He listened patiently, and when I finally stopped, his voice was calm but serious. He told me I wasn't alone and promised to help me however he could. 2 days later, he showed up at my apartment with coffee and a folder full of documents. He laid everything out on my kitchen table, ready to strategize. Henry's presence was a lifeline I desperately needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone truly understood the magnitude of what I was facing. Together, we began piecing together a plan to hold my parents accountable, not just for the money, but for the trust they had betrayed and the damage they had caused. When Uncle Henry sat across from me in my tiny kitchen, his calm, steady demeanor was like a lifeline. He spread the documents across the table, each one a tangible reminder of the betrayal I was fighting to comprehend. He looked at me with a seriousness that told me he was fully committed to helping me, and his first words were both practical and grounding. First things first, he said, we need to understand exactly what happened. Do you have any records of the fund, statements, account details, anything at all? I nodded, reaching for the stack of papers I had hastily gathered but had been too overwhelmed to organize. Uncle Henry spent over an hour going through everything, methodically taking notes, asking questions, and piecing together the puzzle of my parents' actions. Finally, he looked up, his face set with a mix of concern and determination. From what I can see, he said, your parents had access to the fund as trustees, but that doesn't give them the right to use the money for anything other than your education. What they did is a breach of fiduciary duty, and that's a big deal. Hearing him frame their actions as more than just morally wrong, but legally indefensible, was a revelation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like someone truly understood the gravity of what I was facing. Uncle Henry didn't waste any time. The very next day, he contacted a lawyer he knew, a woman named Jessica, who specialized in family disputes and financial abuse cases. Jessica agreed to meet with us the following week, and though I was nervous, I knew I had no choice but to move forward. The meeting with Jessica was daunting. Her office, sleek and modern with rows of legal books lining the shelves, felt intimidating at first. But her calm, professional demeanor quickly put me at ease. As I told her everything, how my grandparents had set up the fund, how my parents had withdrawn money without my consent, and how they had used it to buy a house for Luke and Megan, she listened intently, her pen gliding across her notepad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked me in the eye. Emily, from what you've told me, it sounds like your parents violated the terms of the trust. This isn't just a family disagreement. It's a legal issue, and you have every right to pursue it. She outlined the steps we needed to take, gathering evidence, filing a formal complaint, and potentially taking the case to court if my parents refused to cooperate. It all sounded overwhelming, but Uncle Henry squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. We've got this, kiddo, he said. You're not alone. Our first move was to send my parents a formal demand letter, drafted by Jessica. It outlined the breach of fiduciary duty and demanded they return the money to the fund. Jessica warned me this would likely escalate things, and she wasn't wrong. A week after the letter was sent, my mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. Her face was a mask of fury as she waved the letter in my face. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained. "It's exactly what it says. You took my money, and I'm demanding you pay it back." She laughed bitterly, her tone dripping with disdain. "You're really going to sue your own parents? Do you have any idea how ridiculous that makes you look?" I refused to back down. "Do you have any idea how wrong what you did was? Grandma and Grandpa left that money for my education, not for you to play real estate agents for Luke and Megan." Her response was as dismissive as ever. "We were helping the family. You're being selfish and ungrateful." The word selfish cut deeper than I expected. How could they twist this situation to make me the villain? My anger boiled over, and I shouted, "You stole from me, and I'm selfish?" She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but the fallout didn't end there. My parents began spreading rumors within the family, painting me as an ungrateful brat who was out to destroy them. Luke wasn't much better. He called me to say I was tearing the family apart and insisted I needed to let it go. When I confronted him about benefiting from the stolen money, he shrugged it off, claiming it wasn't his fault and that he didn't ask them to use the money. Through it all, Uncle Henry was my rock. He reminded me that I was in the right, that my parents' actions were not only unethical, but illegal. His unwavering support kept me grounded as we moved forward with the case. The legal proceedings were slow and grueling. My parents refused to cooperate, even going so far as to claim they had used the money for my benefit, a blatant lie. Jessica was relentless, subpoenaing bank records, emails, and other documents that painted a clear picture of their actions. The evidence was damning. Every transaction was accounted for, showing exactly how they had drained the fund to finance Luke and Megan's house. Eventually, the case went to court. Sitting in that courtroom was one of the most emotionally taxing experiences of my life. My parents, still unwilling to accept responsibility, tried to justify their actions, claiming they had acted in the family's best interest. My mom even broke down in tears at one point, insisting they had done what they thought was right. Jessica, however, was methodical and precise. She laid out the facts with clarity, showing the judge exactly how my parents had violated their fiduciary duties. The judge's ruling was clear and unequivocal. My parents were found guilty of breaching the trust and were ordered to repay the money with interest. They were also removed as trustees, ensuring they could no longer manage or access the account. It was a bittersweet victory. While I felt a sense of justice, the damage to my family was irreparable. My parents haven't spoken to me since the ruling, and Luke and Megan made it clear they were on my parents' side. The family I had once hoped to mend was now shattered beyond repair. The only silver lining was Uncle Henry. His support never wavered, and he reminded me that family isn't about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when it matters most. Thanks to him and Jessica, I was able to restore the fund and cover my university expenses as planned. The experience left scars, but it also taught me the importance of standing up for myself, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Now, as I move forward, I focus on building a life rooted in integrity and independence. My grandparents' legacy wasn't just the money they left behind. It was the values they instilled in me: perseverance, courage, and the strength to fight for what's right. Despite everything, I know they would be proud of the choices I've made and the person I'm becoming. As the mediation session unfolded, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Philip Green, my parents' lawyer, began spinning his narrative. He claimed my parents acted in what they believed to be the best interest of their family. He painted a picture of loving parents supporting their son and his fiancée during a pivotal time in their lives, as if that somehow justified stealing my education fund. Jessica wasn't having it. She countered calmly but firmly, pointing out that good intentions didn't make their actions legal. The trust agreement was explicit. The money was for my education, and any other use constituted a clear breach of fiduciary duty. Her words sliced through Philip's argument, but the room remained tense as Karen, the mediator, turned to my parents. She asked if they would like to respond directly. My mom finally spoke up, her tone wavering between defensive and dismissive. She insisted they hadn't meant any harm and thought there would still be enough money left for my education. She stressed they hadn't spent the money on themselves, as if that made it acceptable. Her words were the same dismissive justifications I had heard before, and something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay silent any longer. My voice trembled as I confronted them, laying bare the stress and anguish their actions had caused me. I told them how their betrayal had forced me to put my future on hold, how I'd had to fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine. My dad glared at me, interrupting to declare that as my parents, they had done more for me than I could ever understand. He even had the gall to suggest I should be grateful they had left some of the money in the fund. Jessica placed a steadying hand on my arm, reminding me to focus on the facts. Then she introduced the piece of evidence that turned the tide, an email exchange between my parents. In one of the messages, my mom had written, "Emily doesn't need all that money for school. This is a better way to use it." Philip tried to argue that the emails were being taken out of context, but it was clear the damage was done. Karen leaned forward, her expression serious, and addressed the room. She stated plainly that the emails, along with the evidence Jessica presented, demonstrated a breach of the trust agreement. If the case went to trial, she believed the court would rule in my favor. At that point, my parents began to squirm. My mom whispered urgently to my dad, and they exchanged nervous glances. Philip requested a brief recess, and they stepped out to confer. When they returned, Philip announced that my parents were willing to negotiate a repayment plan. They proposed returning the full amount of $180,000 over 10 years. Jessica immediately rejected the offer, arguing that I needed the money now to cover my education. Uncle Henry chimed in, pointing out the absurdity of the situation. If they could spend $250,000 on a house, they could figure out how to repay $180,000 without dragging it out for a decade. The discussion dragged on for hours. My parents claimed they didn't have the money to repay me immediately, but Jessica pushed back, highlighting the assets they still held, including my grandparents' house. Eventually, under the looming threat of a trial, my parents caved. They agreed to return the full $180,000 within 6 months. Karen drafted a settlement agreement, and everyone signed it. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was bittersweet. The legal battle was over, but the emotional toll was impossible to ignore. After the mediation, my brother Luke reached out to me. I hadn't spoken to him since the legal proceedings began, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear from him. Still, something in his voice made me hesitate. He sounded nervous, almost vulnerable. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and I sat across from him, arms crossed, prepared for excuses. But what he said surprised me. He admitted that he had known what my parents were doing and hadn't stopped them. He confessed that he had justified it to himself at the time, convincing himself it wasn't his responsibility. Now he realized how wrong he had been. His apology was genuine, and though part of me wanted to hold on to my anger, I saw how hard it was for him to admit his role. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but that the hurt didn't disappear overnight. I needed time to rebuild trust, and he promised to earn it. Slowly, we began to repair our relationship. While I wasn't ready to rely on him yet, I could see he was making an effort. Meanwhile, my parents completely cut off contact. Their refusal to speak to me was both a relief and a heartbreak I hadn't anticipated. It felt like losing a part of my family, even if that part had been toxic. Uncle Henry, as always, was my anchor. He helped me find a small apartment near campus, co-signed the lease, and even helped me move in. As we unpacked boxes in my tiny kitchen, he told me, "This is a fresh start, Emily. You've been through hell, but you're stronger because of it." The biggest surprise came a few weeks later. I had applied for every scholarship I could find, not expecting much, but then a letter from my university arrived. I had been awarded a full scholarship, tuition, housing, books, everything. Overwhelmed with joy, I called Uncle Henry immediately. "I got it," I shouted into the phone. "The full scholarship. I'm going to school." His laughter was deep and heartfelt. "I knew you'd do it. Your grandparents would be so proud of you, Emily. You've earned this." Those words stayed with me. My grandparents' legacy wasn't just the money they left behind. It was their belief in me and the future they wanted me to have. Uncle Henry shared stories about them I had never heard before, stories about their kindness, sacrifices, and resilience. They had worked so hard to ensure I had opportunities they never did. And even though my parents had tried to take that away, I had fought to honor their wishes. Sitting in my new apartment, surrounded by books and plans for the future, I finally felt at peace. I wasn't just fighting for my education. I was fighting for the values my grandparents had instilled in me. Despite everything, I knew they would be proud of the choices I'd made and the person I was becoming.